When people hear that someone saved their first $100,000 by the age of 24, they usually assume one of three things. They inherited money, they landed an unusually high-paying job, or they simply got lucky. It's an understandable conclusion. After all, reaching six figures before most people have even settled into their careers sounds almost impossible. But what if none of those explanations were true? What if the biggest factor wasn't a massive income, but a collection of ordinary habits that most people dismiss because they seem too small to matter? That's the strange thing about wealth. We notice the dramatic moments, the promotion, the investment that doubles, the new house, the six-figure milestone. But we rarely notice the thousands of tiny decisions that quietly built the foundation years earlier. Imagine two recent college graduates. Both are 22 years old. Both earn roughly $65,000 a year. Both rent similar apartments. Both drive reliable used cars. Both have student loans. At first glance, their lives look almost identical. Fast forward just 2 years. One has accumulated nearly $100,000 between savings, investments, and cash. The other is still living paycheck to paycheck despite earning a slightly higher salary. The difference wasn't intelligence. It wasn't luck. And it certainly wasn't because one person never enjoyed life. The difference came from dozens of seemingly insignificant choices that quietly compounded into something extraordinary. Because saving your first $100,000 is rarely about one brilliant financial decision. It's usually the result of hundreds of boring ones. And perhaps the biggest surprise is this. Many of these habits don't even feel like sacrifices after a while. They simply become part of who you are. Today, we're going to explore 20 frugal habits that made reaching that first $100,000 possible by the age of 24. But this isn't another list telling you to skip your morning coffee or never have fun. The deeper lesson isn't about being cheap. It's about understanding which everyday decisions quietly shape your financial future, and which ones slowly steal it without you noticing. Because once you understand the psychology behind these habits, you'll realize they were never just about saving money. They were about buying freedom. And the first habit begins long before a single dollar is saved. It starts with changing what success looks like. Most people spend money to make their lives appear successful. The irony is that the people building real wealth often do the exact opposite. For years, I noticed something interesting about financially successful people. Many drove ordinary cars. They kept their phones for years. Their clothes were simple. Their homes were comfortable rather than extravagant. Meanwhile, people earning far less often felt pressured to look far wealthier than they actually were. This is where one of the most expensive psychological traps begins: status spending. Behavioral economists have long observed that humans don't buy many products simply because they need them. They buy them because of what those products communicate. A luxury watch doesn't only tell time. A designer handbag doesn't only carry belongings. A brand new luxury SUV doesn't only provide transportation. Each purchase quietly sends a message. I've made it. I'm successful. I belong. The problem is that status symbols often provide temporary emotional rewards while creating long-term financial costs. Imagine receiving a $10,000 raise. At first it feels life-changing, but then a nicer apartment seems reasonable. A newer car suddenly feels affordable. Dining out becomes more frequent. Vacations become slightly more luxurious. Streaming subscriptions multiply. Within months, that raise has quietly disappeared. Nothing feels extravagant. Each upgrade seems harmless on its own. Yet together, they've consumed nearly every additional dollar. This phenomenon is known as lifestyle inflation, and it's one of the biggest reasons income alone rarely creates wealth. Research consistently shows that as earnings increase, spending often rises almost automatically. People don't necessarily become richer. They simply become more expensive versions of themselves. The hidden cost isn't today's spending. It's tomorrow's missed opportunities. Every extra $500 spent each month isn't just $500 gone. It's money that could have been invested for decades. At an average annual return of around 8%, investing $500 each month from age 24 could potentially grow into well over $1 million by retirement. That's the part most people never see. They compare purchases to today's bank balance instead of tomorrow's net worth. This is why the first frugal habit wasn't clipping coupons or obsessing over discounts. It was refusing to let income automatically dictate lifestyle. Every raise became an opportunity to increase investing before increasing spending. The lifestyle improved gradually, but the investments grew much faster. And that leads to another habit that seems almost boring, yet quietly changes everything. Paying yourself before you ever have the chance to spend. Most people save whatever remains at the end of the month. The problem is that there's rarely much left. Money has an unusual way of disappearing when it sits in a checking account. A spontaneous dinner, a weekend trip, an online sale, a subscription you forgot existed. Individually, these purchases don't seem significant. Collectively, they quietly compete with your future. So instead of relying on willpower, the money moved automatically. The moment each paycheck arrived, a predetermined percentage flowed directly into savings and investment accounts before it could be touched. There was no monthly debate, no emotional decision, no wondering whether enough would be left. The decision had already been made. Psychologists call this reducing decision fatigue. Every financial choice requires mental energy. The fewer decisions you leave to emotion, the more consistent your behavior becomes. Ironically, building wealth often has less to do with self-control and more to do with designing systems that make good decisions happen automatically. Because people don't usually fail financially from one catastrophic mistake. More often, they lose slowly. One unnecessary purchase here, another upgrade there, a little convenience today, a little indulgence tomorrow. Nothing feels dangerous in the moment. But over years, those tiny decisions quietly shape two completely different financial lives. And the next habit may be the most misunderstood of them all. It wasn't about spending less. It was about learning when spending more actually saves money. That idea sounds backwards at first. How could spending more possibly be a frugal habit? Because frugality isn't about paying the lowest price. It's about paying the lowest lifetime cost. And those are often two very different things. Think about someone who buys a pair of cheap work shoes for $40. 6 months later, the soles wear out. They buy another pair, then another. 5 years later, they've spent several $100s replacing something that could have lasted the entire time if they had invested in quality from the beginning. The same principle applies to kitchen appliances, office chairs, mattresses, laptops, winter coats, and even reliable vehicles. The cheapest option often becomes the most expensive one over time. But there's another layer that most people never think about. Cheap products don't just cost more money. They often cost time. A slow laptop wastes minutes every day. An unreliable car creates unexpected repairs. Poor quality tools make simple tasks frustrating. Those lost hours are impossible to recover. One question became incredibly useful before making any purchase. Am I buying the cheapest item or the best value over the next 5 to 10 years? That single question eliminated countless impulse purchases while making the important purchases much easier. And speaking of impulse purchases, one habit quietly prevented thousands of dollars from leaving the bank account. It was surprisingly simple. Nothing expensive was purchased immediately. There was always a waiting period. Sometimes 24 hours, sometimes 3 days, sometimes an entire month. At first, it felt unnecessary, but something interesting started happening. Most things that felt urgent on Monday no longer seemed important by Friday. That's because impulse buying isn't really about the product. It's about emotion. We're excited. We're stressed. We're celebrating. We're bored. Retailers understand this remarkably well. Limited time offers, flash sales, countdown timers. Only 2 left in stock. These messages aren't designed to help you make better decisions. They're designed to make sure you don't have enough time to think. Behavioral researchers call this present bias. Humans naturally place a higher value on immediate rewards than future benefits, even when waiting would clearly produce a better outcome. The waiting rule interrupted that emotional cycle. It created space between wanting something and buying it. Surprisingly, most purchases disappeared during that space, and the ones that remained were usually worth making. But perhaps the most powerful habit wasn't about avoiding purchases. It was about understanding where happiness actually comes from. Many people unconsciously believe that spending creates happiness. Sometimes it does. A meaningful vacation with family, a hobby that improves your life, experiences that strengthen relationships. Those can absolutely be worthwhile. But many purchases lose their excitement much faster than expected. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. Humans quickly become accustomed to improvements. The new phone feels amazing for about 2 weeks. The new car feels exciting for a few months. The larger apartment becomes normal. The expensive watch eventually becomes invisible. The happiness fades, while the monthly payment remains. Recognizing this pattern changed spending completely. Instead of asking, will this make me happy today? The better question became, will this still improve my life a year from now? That one question filtered out an incredible number of unnecessary expenses. Because temporary excitement rarely creates lasting satisfaction. Freedom does. And freedom comes from options. Having enough savings to leave a toxic job. Enough investments to survive an emergency. Enough flexibility to take advantage of opportunities when they appear. Those forms of happiness don't disappear after a few weeks. They often grow stronger over time. Another surprisingly effective habit involves something almost everyone overlooks. Learning to enjoy free entertainment again. Some of the most enjoyable weekends cost almost nothing. Walking through local parks, reading library books, hosting game nights with friends, cooking meals together instead of eating out, hiking, community events, free museums, public concerts. The goal wasn't to avoid spending money. It was to stop assuming that spending more automatically created better experiences. In many cases, it didn't. And that realization had an unexpected psychological effect. When your happiness becomes less dependent on consumption, saving money no longer feels like deprivation. It simply becomes your normal way of living. But perhaps one of the biggest financial advantages came from a habit that almost nobody talks about: avoiding unnecessary upgrades. Modern marketing constantly tells us that everything should be replaced. The newest phone, the newest car, the newest furniture, the newest fashion, as if owning the latest version somehow makes life significantly better. In reality, most upgrades offer surprisingly small improvements for surprisingly large costs. Keeping a phone for 5 or 6 years instead of upgrading every 2, driving a reliable vehicle long after it's paid off, repairing furniture instead of replacing it, those decisions rarely attract attention. But they quietly free up thousands of dollars every single year. Money that can be invested instead of depreciating in the driveway or sitting in your pocket. This creates something psychologists call delayed gratification. The willingness to accept a smaller reward today for a much larger reward tomorrow. Study after study has found that people who consistently delay gratification tend to achieve better long-term financial outcomes. Not because they have more discipline than everyone else, but because they've trained themselves to think beyond today's emotions. And eventually, something fascinating begins to happen. Your investments start working harder than your paycheck. At first, every dollar invested feels insignificant. The account grows painfully slowly. A few $100s, then a few thousand. Progress feels almost invisible. It's easy to wonder whether it's even making a difference. But this is exactly where most people quit. They expect dramatic results too early. They underestimate the quiet power of compounding. And that's where the journey to the first $100,000 becomes much more interesting. Because the hardest part isn't building wealth. The hardest part is staying consistent long enough for wealth to begin building itself. This is where almost every wealth-building story begins to separate into two very different paths. One person sees slow progress and decides it isn't worth the effort. The other understands that slow progress isn't a sign that the system is broken. It's a sign that the system is working exactly as expected. Building your first $100,000 often feels frustrating because the numbers don't seem to move fast enough. During the first few years, every contribution comes almost entirely from your own paycheck. Your investments contribute very little. You're doing nearly all the work. Imagine pushing a massive flywheel. The first few pushes barely move it. You push again and again. Nothing dramatic happens. It's tempting to stop because your effort doesn't seem to match the results. But eventually, the wheel begins to turn on its own. Each push builds on the last. That's exactly how compounding works. In the beginning, your savings create your investment account. Later, your investment account begins creating more wealth than your savings ever could. That shift is one of the most important moments in any financial journey. And it's the reason so many investors say the first $100,000 feels much harder than the second. Not because saving suddenly becomes easier, but because your money finally starts becoming an employee instead of remaining your responsibility alone. Another habit made reaching that point much more likely. Income was treated as something to grow, not just something to protect. There's a limit to how much you can cut expenses. You can only cancel so many subscriptions. You can only cook at home so many nights. You can only negotiate your bills so far. But there's far less of a ceiling on increasing your earning potential. Learning a valuable skill, negotiating a raise, changing companies, taking on freelance work, starting a small side business, earning certifications. Every increase in income became an opportunity, not to upgrade life immediately, but to widen the gap between earnings and spending. That gap is where wealth is created. Many people experience lifestyle inflation every time they receive a raise. Instead, imagine receiving an extra $8,000 a year and deciding that only $2,000 improves your lifestyle, while the remaining $6,000 immediately goes toward investments. Your quality of life still improves, but your financial future improves much faster. This simple habit creates a powerful cycle. Higher income leads to higher investing. Higher investing leads to larger investment growth. Larger investment growth creates more financial freedom, and financial freedom creates more choices. Those choices are often worth far more than expensive possessions. Another habit that quietly accelerated the journey was tracking net worth instead of obsessing over income. Most people know exactly how much they earn. Far fewer know how much they actually own. Income tells you how much money comes in. Net worth tells you whether you're actually becoming wealthier. Someone earning $250,000 while carrying heavy debt may have a lower net worth than someone earning half as much who consistently saves and invests. That's why checking net worth every month became more meaningful than checking a paycheck. It shifted attention away from consumption and toward progress. Even small improvements became motivating: a debt balance shrinking, an investment account growing, an emergency fund reaching another milestone. Those weren't just numbers. They were evidence that financial freedom was becoming more real. Perhaps the most underrated habit, however, had nothing to do with budgeting, investing, or saving. It was choosing the right people. Money habits are surprisingly contagious. If everyone around you constantly upgrades cars, takes on unnecessary debt, shops for entertainment, and measures success through appearances. That behavior slowly begins to feel normal. On the other hand, spending time with people who value investing, learning, patience, and long-term thinking changes your definition of normal. Without realizing it, you begin adopting similar habits. Psychologists refer to this as social proof. Humans naturally look to those around them to determine appropriate behavior. It's one of the reasons advertising frequently shows products being enjoyed by happy, successful people. Our brains are wired to imitate. Choosing a healthier financial environment often requires no additional discipline. The environment itself begins making better decisions feel natural. And finally, there was one habit that tied everything together: remembering the purpose of money. Money is often mistaken for the goal. It isn't. Money is a tool. Its greatest value isn't found in expensive purchases. It's found in the freedom it creates. Freedom to leave a stressful job. Freedom to take time off when family needs you. Freedom to handle emergencies without panic. Freedom to pursue meaningful work instead of simply chasing the next paycheck. The first $100,000 wasn't exciting because of the number itself. It mattered because every dollar represented another small piece of independence. Looking back, none of these habits felt extraordinary on any single day. Driving the same reliable car for another year didn't feel life-changing. Cooking dinner at home didn't feel life-changing. Waiting a week before buying something didn't feel life-changing. Automatically investing every payday didn't feel life-changing. Reading instead of shopping didn't feel life-changing. But together, they completely changed the direction of a financial life. And that's the hidden truth behind almost every wealth-building journey. People often believe wealth is built through a few spectacular decisions. In reality, it's usually built through thousands of ordinary ones that nobody applauds. The world celebrates visible success, the promotion, the new home, the investment milestone, but it rarely celebrates the invisible behaviors that made those achievements possible. Choosing patience over impulse, consistency over excitement, freedom over appearance. Those choices rarely look impressive today. But over years, they quietly become the foundation of financial independence. So if you're waiting for the perfect investment, the perfect salary, or the perfect opportunity, you may be overlooking the one thing that matters most. The habits you repeat this week will shape the financial life you live years from now. Because the first $100,000 isn't really a story about money. It's a story about identity. It's about becoming the kind of person who consistently chooses tomorrow over today. And once that identity takes root, the number itself becomes almost inevitable. The greatest transformation isn't watching your bank account grow. It's realizing that the habits which built your wealth also built a calmer mind, greater confidence, and a level of freedom that no purchase could ever provide. In the end, the real reward was never reaching six figures by 24. It was learning a lesson that lasts a lifetime. Small decisions, repeated consistently, create extraordinary futures.